Okay, it's 11:05. We're going to go ahead and start the webinar. I'll present today's speaker, Lee Barnes. Lee is a 20-year veteran in the software quality space as an engineer, manager, and thought leader. Lee is Chief Technology Officer of Utopia Solutions. Lee, you want to go ahead and get started?
Thank you, and thank you all for taking the time to join me today. A little bit about myself real quick. As CTO of Utopia Solutions, I'm responsible for the solutions we deliver, and that includes both services and the technology that supports them. One of our core services is test automation, and I started in test automation a little over 20 years ago. And through the years, most of what I have learned has been through the school of automation hard knocks. And I was fortunate enough in my career over the years to be put in a position, especially early, that allowed me to try and fail, of course, as long as I was learning from those failures. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is as much about avoiding those paths to failure as it is getting on the path to success. So to that end, I want to set the table by looking at the questions that we want to answer today. And those are, what are we trying to accomplish with test automation? Why do we need a strategy and not just a tool and a framework? And probably most importantly, how do we know if we're ready to succeed, and what does that path to success look like? And finally, just to kind of set the table and level set us all a little bit, the scope of our discussion today is system-level regression testing. Automation can mean a lot of things in software development, and the context certainly changes that meaning, and most importantly, the approach. So much of what I'm going to talk about today, for example, wouldn't be applicable to automated unit testing. So just so we're all on the same page. So let's take a level set and get on that page of, with respect to what our automation objectives are. Most implementations that I see have one or more of these objectives in place. But over the years, I found that increasing the value of your resources by not having them do repetitive, tedious tasks is really the biggest gain that organizations can realize from automation. Instead of executing regression tests, they're focused on using their experience and expertise for test case definition, exploratory testing, and other higher value activities. And one thing I want to point out is that I specifically don't include find more defects as one of automation goals. I do see that fairly often, but if we're talking about regression testing, and I am, then I'm of the belief that the number of defects found via automation is really not a valid metric. If you're finding a lot of defects in your automated testing or any regression testing, then you probably have some serious issues upstream that are continually introducing these regressions. And that really has nothing to do with the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of your test automation implementation. So before we move on, let's take a look at typical test automation success criteria. Specifically, from an automation perspective, we want our solution to have these three attributes. We want reliable execution, so we want execution that runs completely without interruption, and of course we want our results to be accurate. Second, we want maintainability, and I think this is pretty basic, but if we spend more time maintaining our solution than we would have we stayed with manual execution, we can't really say that we're successful. Finally, the solution should be scalable. For me, this means I can expand, I can change my test coverage efficiently. I don't necessarily need an automation engineer to do that. And what's only implied here, but really important, is cost and value. Your test automation solution can be all of these things, but in the end, I really can't say I'm successful if the solution isn't providing value to the organization. So you have to get that ROI that everyone talks about. So why do we need a strategy? Just because you understand what successful automation looks like, it's really not enough. And I don't even think it's close to enough. A long time ago, I was in that group of people that thought that automation was getting the right tool and building the right framework. But occasionally we'd have what we thought was a successful implementation, and that would come back to bite us after some time. It wasn't being used, it wasn't providing the value. The reasons varied. It might have been maintenance was excessive. It might have been execution was unreliable. But what we found in looking at these implementations that had gone south over a period of time was that there were some common attributes that were all in place, and they were fundamental to supporting successful test automation, and they had nothing to do with the tool or how the framework was structured. And that is what we're going to discuss today. So, but in order to understand why we need a strategy, I think it helps to look at why automation fails. And despite the most sophisticated tools and the best architected frameworks, test automation implementations fail at a pretty alarming rate. And I'm not just talking about the huge mushroom cloud type failures. I'm talking about implementations that may still be ongoing, but not delivering any value to the organization. That's a failure. You're taking on more risk to your testing, probably doing less testing than you would looking at a complete manual regression, but you're getting nothing back in return. So I've listed some common reasons here that we've seen over the years that contribute to failure. And the most important ones, which is going to be the focus of the discussion today, has nothing to do with the framework. And these are related to the organization, processes, and environment. So how do we know if we're ready so we don't end up looking a lot like this person here? And I used to have a different image here that I found out I didn't have permission to use, and it was of a surprise-looking baby that had just been thrown into a swimming pool. And I often use the analogy that automation is a lot like swimming. You have to have a certain state of readiness, or the consequences are not going to be good. So the next portion of the webinar is going to talk about how we go about understanding if we're ready. And to use an example, I was involved in a test automation assessment last summer that I'll use as a bit of a case study throughout this talk. The large enterprise IT shop had a successful automated solution for a single application. And of course, they wanted to duplicate that across other important applications that had large regression suites. After a few months of starting 4 new additional implementations, they weren't having much success, weren't making much progress, and they had asked for help in understanding why. And what we found across the 5 solutions was 1 phenomenal success, which they already knew about, and 4 abysmal failures. And what's interesting and also a bit sad is that the 4 projects were failing for completely different reasons. And we'll examine more about that as we go through. But it really pointed to the fact that the fundamental things we're going to talk about today need to be in place independent of the technology, the tool, or the framework that you're building. So how do we know if we're ready? We like to do what we call a test automation readiness assessment, and our goal here is not to perform a 6-month resource-intensive cavity search, but rather take a reasonably close look at key areas that we believe are very fundamental and foundational to test automation success. We divide the assessment into 3 high-level areas: organizational, process, and technology. So for the next few minutes, I want to take a more close look at each one and discuss some of the important questions that we'd like to get answered inside each of those areas. So first, from an organization perspective, I want to understand 3 main things. Do we have reasonable expectations for automation? And are we structured in a way that supports optimal automation? I'm talking about the organizational structure, where people fit in the organization. And do we have the right resources and skills to be successful? Looking at expectations, unrealistic expectations are extremely common. And in my opinion, we have the commercial tool vendors to thank for that. When I first got started in test automation many years ago, tool vendors based their entire sales demos on that damn record button and other similarly easy-to-use features that were more marketing things than anything else. So as a whole, that's that was our introduction to automation. That's what we thought the correct approach was, and that kind of snowballed into other unrealistic expectations that we'll talk about in a little bit. From an organization perspective, where test automation sits within an organization is very important, especially for groups that want to implement automation across multiple projects, teams, business units, what have you. Attempting to start and maintain multiple independent automation functions is extremely difficult and will likely limit the benefits you can realize over time. And I've got a little bit about that on the next slide. Finally, what skills you have and are they appropriately dedicated to automation is important. If you have resources that maybe have the foundational skills but have other priorities, you're likely not ready to succeed. And especially if those resources don't understand what successful automation looks like. So, they may be tool jockeys, or what I like to call tool jockeys. So they understand, the tool, they understand framework architecture, but they don't understand the process, the environment, and the organization-related requirements. You're likely not ready. So sprinkled throughout the webinar, I've got a handful of slides that discuss findings that seem to pop up over and over again when we do these assessments. And the first one is distributed and disassociated test automation efforts. We often find, especially in large groups, completely separate automation efforts, often using not only different resources, but different tools and approaches. That example that I mentioned earlier had a total of 4 different tools across the 5 separate automation efforts. And it had nothing to do with necessity or any type of investigation that was done to identify the appropriate tool. No one asked. No one asked if there was any tools or any existing expertise in-house. And in addition to that, across the 4 tools, there were 4 different approaches, ranging from straight record and playback, and yes, apparently that's still a thing, to extremely over-engineered frameworks that only its creator could ever have any hope of maintaining. And what we saw as the biggest issue was that the 5 teams were all part of the same organization, albeit on different projects, but there was absolutely nothing in place to allow them to function as a team, nothing to allow them to share information, and certainly nothing to allow them to collaborate on the efforts. And what that, as the slide shows, what that led to, certainly inconsistent approach. There was some duplication of efforts, especially among the failures, and the skill growth and certainly the knowledge sharing was non-existent. And another issue that we see is uneven automation resource demand, right? An individual project, the demand for an automation resource can be spiky. If you combine that effort across a group of people and across multiple projects, you can even out that demand curve and make better use of the resources you've identified to be automation engineers. So moving on to process and environment questions that we need to ask. I need to understand from a process and environment perspective, first of all, do my testing processes support automation? Second, are my development and testing processes integrated? And I'll talk more about what that means in a second. And finally, do I have test environments that are suitable to support long-term test automation success? From a test process perspective, that is critical in understanding what your test automation scope should be. What are your regression testing objectives? How frequently do you execute regression tests? Or more importantly, how often should you execute regression tests? Because we often find if it's 100% manual, that how frequently you execute and the scope of what you execute is limited by bandwidth and budget, not necessarily by what you feel is the optimum scope. It's also good to go beyond test cases and look for other testing activities that can benefit from automation. Test data creation setup, tedious output verification are really good candidates for that. It's also a good opportunity to examine how you're testing. So we have a a client that develops an ERP system for the electrical retrofit industry. And what their system does is take in results of audits of huge commercial buildings, so essentially what lighting fixtures they have and what electrical systems they have, and spits out estimates and work plans for retrofitting those buildings. And they had invested an extreme amount of effort in automation, but they focused 100% on automating the UI and verifying that hundreds of different types of audits resulted in the correct estimates and work plans, but through a very complex UI proved to be very difficult for them. But it turned out that all the audit information came into the system as an XML file, and that the estimates and work plans were output as XML files. So they implemented what they ultimately called bulk data verification, as they input their audits and verified manually the first time that the output was correct, and they became the gold copies. And then they did most of their automated testing by sucking in these audit files and then verifying that the output matched the gold copy. They still did UI level testing from an automation perspective, but they were focused just on the mechanics of the UI, which was much more straightforward than trying to navigate through these complex inputs and outputs. Next, from a development perspective, if you're in a situation where code is thrown over the wall for regression testing, and that's the first time the automation engineers are aware of changes that impact the test suite, you're likely not ready. We need to understand what's being changed so we can assess the impact and have a reasonable amount of runway to address that impact. And we'll look at more of that as an example on the next slide. Finally, if we understand that we have an environment that's suitable for, we need to understand if we have an environment that's suitable for executing automation. If your only environment is shared by other testing activities and you have no control over the data in that environment, you're going to find that you're likely not ready for long-term success. So here's another example of common finding. And that's, as I just mentioned, not having the automated test suite ready to execute when it's time. Even the most maintainable frameworks are not going to provide a lot of help if the first time the automation engineers learn about app changes that impact the automated test suite is when the code is moved into the test environment. Right? Now you're in the spotlight and you have to figure out what's not working and why, kind of on the fly, and that's just not an ideal situation to be in. So rather, you need to capture those potential impacts as early as possible. Independent of the type of development cycle, whether it's Agile or Waterfall or something in between, changes are being dreamed of, designed, prototyped, and coded. Right? And you need to insert yourself into the right communication channel so you can understand what those changes are and how they're coming down the pipe and how they're ultimately going to impact your automated test suite. The answer varies across organizations. It varies across development cycles, but the information is there, and you need to capture it as early as possible. So when the spotlight goes on and people are expecting test results, you're ready to deliver. So another common finding is a shared test environment, one where we have many types of testing activities and no control over the data. At the very best, you're going to have schedule conflicts, and in most cases, your execution is going to be extremely unreliable. And if you do get some reasonable level of reliability in this environment, it's probably because you've spent a great deal of time and effort hardening the test suite so it can handle some of the unexpected environment and data issues that it might encounter. And we'll talk about this more later when we talk about the strategy component. The more you can do to address control over the environment, control over the data, the less you'll have to do in the automated test suite. And from a long-term cost of ownership perspective, addressing that in the environment and data level is much more cost efficient. So finally, from an assessment perspective, we need to look at some technical questions. And I want to understand two main areas. First, what applications are in scope or potentially in scope for my automation efforts, and where am I from a tool perspective? It's very important to think about the applications you may want to automate and not just blindly plow ahead on the first one in front of you. And you'd be surprised how often that we see that, where there's a directive to implement automation, and the one that gets automated is the one that the automation engineer or the assigned automation engineer is more familiar with, but really no understanding of why. But you should look at the technologies, the testing scope, the frequency of testing, where the apps are in their life cycle, to help you determine which applications are better candidates. I was involved in one project, this was quite a while ago, that resulted in what appeared to be a very successful implementation, automation implementation. However, no one, and me included, looked far enough down the road. And that system that we had just automated was replaced with a packaged solution. It was a homegrown system that we automated. It was replaced with a packaged solution about 12 months after we finished that automation effort. And of course, most, if not all, of what we built was useless. And so I guarantee someone in an organization knew that was coming, right? But changes like that in large enterprises don't happen overnight or in 12 months. And the question should have been asked, and that effort should have been postponed at least. So very important to understand where the applications are in their life cycle. From a tool perspective, do we have access to any tools? And of course, do those tools support your application? And if you don't have an automation tool, do you understand how to select one? You know, not just the market leader or not just the lowest cost, right? But do you really understand what's important in an automation tool? I argue all the time that the tool, if it supports your application, if it can integrate with, do the things you need to do from a testing perspective, is less important than the approach, and the approach, how you build the framework, is even less important than these foundational factors that we're talking about today. But you certainly don't want to grab a tool for the sake of grabbing a tool because maybe someone has used it in the past, or again, it's a market leader, or it's the lowest cost option. You want to find one that's going to promote long-term success, and I think you'll find if, and today, what's long-term, right? Technology changes very rapidly, so we're not talking 20 years, but if we can get a payback over a handful of years, probably the cost of the tool, whether it was open source or commercial, is going to be less important. All right, so from a readiness perspective, we've looked at the organizational, the process, the technical related areas that we need to examine to understand how ready we are to implement automation. We have a bunch of information now, so let's now talk about how we can use that to build a strategy that will go a long way to helping you sustain successful automation. I like to organize the information into the following areas that I've put on the slide here: process and organization, environment, technology, resources, scope, and roadmap. And before I go on, if you have any questions, please enter them in the chat window. We have a few so far. You can chat them directly to the chairperson. That's fine. We will have time for a handful of questions after the webinar. Anything that's asked, though, even if we don't answer it live during the webinar, we will respond via email. So please, if there's any questions or comments, please ask them via the chat window. Thank you. All right, so we've got these 5 areas of the test automation strategy. And the foundation of that, and we'll talk more about that on the next slide, is the definition of scope, or what will be automated. and then, of course, the roadmap for implementing that scope, along with any required foundational improvements. So next I'm going to discuss what the ideal looks like in many of these strategic areas. So the next few slides will look a bit like eye charts. That's more for your reference after the webinar. We'll post the slides and the recording. But I'll talk through what I found are some of the most important attributes in each area. If you see any points or have questions on points that I don't address, please ask via the chat window. We can certainly, if we have time at the end, discuss them, or I can reply via email after the fact. All right, moving on to the ideal scope attributes. And I put scope first for a reason. I think all too often it's determined using the wrong factors. The two most important points that I can make on this topic is that you should consider all testing activity and not just the manual test cases. And we'll have more on that in a second. And secondly, do not automate manual test cases verbatim. Meaning don't just take however you've documented your manual test cases and start trying to duplicate that in your automated solution. So first back to the looking at all your testing activity and not just the test cases. So think for a minute about everything you do as part of regression testing, and it's a lot more than just execute test cases. There's probably a lot of that non-test case activity that can benefit from automation. So if I'm talking to someone about automation, it's the first time that we've talked, most common question that I'm asked is, what percentage of my test cases should be automated? And I have a stock answer, it's 47.325. And what's really scary is that I've had more than a few people not realize I'm being sarcastic. But the point is, I want people to kind of snap out of that just looking at test cases in a vacuum mode and look at all your regression testing activity and think about automation more generally and the things that you can do that can benefit from automation, not just automating your step-by-step manual test cases. Second, from automating your manual test cases verbatim perspective, I will hypothesize that the better job you did of writing your manual test cases to be efficiently executed, the worse outcome you'll have if you try to automate them verbatim. And the reason is that you probably designed them to be very dense with test conditions, meaning as you navigate a path within your application, you're hitting as many of those test conditions as possible along the way. And that's great for manual testing because it minimizes your testing time. So serpentine paths through the application with probably frequent side trips to check off random test cases here and there are probably not repeated within a given regression test script. And if they're not repeated, then why automate them? But what is repeated, if not the entire path, are the individual actions, processes, verifications that you're performing along the way. So what you want to do ideally is look at the universe of things that you want to test independent of the detailed steps and data that you use. And I call these test conditions, others might call them test requirements. And then think of the best way to automate those. And it helps me to arrange them in light groups, and you can better visualize how to apply automation. If you have large groups of the same conditions or the same actions, whether they're, it's test case related or test data setup related, then that's a pretty good indication of something that should be automated or certainly should be looked at pretty closely. If you have smaller groups of actions or actions that are only performed once, that's probably a good indicator that they're at least a very low priority or maybe shouldn't be automated at all. Moving on to the ideal organizational attributes, the two key points I want to make here are related to the structure of your automation team and having the appropriate expectations. So I'm a firm believer that having your automation team centralized is the way to go, especially if you're looking to implement automation across multiple projects and applications. And I'm not necessarily talking about a physical centralized team. The team can certainly be virtual, but they have to have a way to communicate, share knowledge, share assets, and function as a team versus individuals. And if you can go one step further and have them function more as a black box resource, which means let them manage the work within the team rather than having individuals assigned to projects or dedicated to projects, that's even better because they can manage the demand better and kind of flatten out the demand curve, but you get almost as a byproduct naturally the cross-training, and any single project you've reduced the risk of a single resource leaving. Finally, I've seen unrealistic expectations doom an implementation before it starts. And you think that by now we've moved beyond the theory that you've implemented automation if you've installed a tool, but it is extremely common. And if you don't have appropriate expectations, you're probably not going to have the right level of support, and which means you probably don't have dedicated budget for automation. Automation isn't represented appropriately on project plans, and you don't probably have the right expectation for what resources you need to be successful with automation. Right? Automation is not going to give you an instant return. It's not just simply a tool installation. It's probably not something that resources who may be exceptional testers and add a lot of value to your organization but have never been involved in automation before, it's probably not something that they're going to succeed at the first time. So understanding that automation is an investment and that requires the foundational components that we're talking about here is extremely important. And if you have the realistic expectation, the appropriate level of support, the budget, getting visibility on the project plans and the right resources dedicated appropriately is just going to naturally flow out of that. Moving on to process and environment attributes. So from that perspective, the two key points that I want to point out are visibility to system changes and controlled test data. I can't say enough, if you find out that you have a maintenance to perform on your automated test suite after you've tried to execute that test suite as part of a real regression run, you're going to be in trouble. Again, the whole organization is looking at you, waiting for test results, and you can't even tell them if you can run the test suite, much less if tests are passing or failing. To avoid that situation, the automation function needs to be inserted in the communication stream. We talked about this earlier, but what that looks like certainly varies across the organization and different types of development approaches, but the information is there and it needs to be captured and acted upon proactively rather than reactively during execution. And you find out that communication doesn't have to be one way. I've seen more than a few instances where having an automation engineer in those communications has resulted in a product that was not only easier to test, but certainly easier to automate. So there may be some design decisions from a development perspective, are 6 of one, half dozen of the other, but to the automation team, it makes something extremely easy to automate and expands your automated regression coverage. Or it could mean that no, we just can't automate those test cases because it's technically too costly to deal with. Finally, test data is, I would say, the most underestimated factor in test automation, especially for organizations that have subject matter experts that execute their manual regression tests. Time and time again, I'll find loosely documented test cases without specific data being executed by high-value resources that have deep business and application knowledge. But they use that knowledge and that experience to fill in the missing pieces. So if a test case is maybe, as the application has evolved, test cases don't quite match the application or the data isn't correct anymore, they have the expertise to make those corrections on the fly and still get valuable testing done. But unfortunately, even the best design automation solutions are typically dumb as a rock when it comes to trying to figure out what to do if a piece of data has been changed unexpectedly. So you really need to control your environment and your data. Now, certainly when I say controlled test data, I'm implying a lot. You need a strategy for ensuring that your automated test suite can execute reliably given your specific data situation. Some examples include restoring to a known state, certainly difficult with the complexity of today's systems. Setting up the required data as part of the execution, that's becoming more common. Identifying data as dedicated to automation. So even if you're in a shared environment, you've got sets of data, maybe entire warehouses or units or SKUs that are dedicated to, and accounts that are dedicated to automation. And for those of you that refresh your test environments from production, we see a lot of organizations that actually seed production with the test data. So when those refreshes happen, that test data comes along for the ride. Now, certainly, depending on security requirements and if you're regulated and a whole bunch of other factors will govern what you can and can't do in that area, but it's something you should consider. And I don't think I've ever seen two organizations with exactly the same test data strategy because of all the differences in applications and environments and regulations and processes. Right? There's a ton of factors that govern what can and can't be done. But you need to perform that activity to understand what you can do and get as much control over the environment and the data as you can to get that predictability that the automated execution wants. I do have one specific word of advice, and that is while you're going through that effort, don't settle for the status quo. Instead, question why data is managed the way it currently is. And oftentimes I've found that the primary reason is, well, that's the way we've always done it, right? And you really need to understand why you refresh from production each month, or why development has 4 environments and QA or test only has 1. And question it, and if there's often there's changes that can be made with little impact to anything that the organization is doing, but can certainly positively impact the automation effort. So finally, from a strategy perspective, we want to understand the roadmap, right? Knowing what to do and doing them are certainly 2 different things. So you need to plan your activities so you have some idea of where you're going and when you're going to get there, and certainly the organization is going to demand that. With that said, we found dividing implementations into fairly small phases results in a better end product. Typically, the first phase includes high priority recommendations that come out of this type of assessment. Your base framework, which would be all the stuff that your automation solution does that's independent of the application, and some initial test coverage or testing activity coverage that proves out both the kind of the foundational process organization stuff and the framework. And then each subsequent phase can continue with recommendations and begin to expand coverage, both on that initial application and subsequent applications if you're growing automation above that initial app. We've also had a lot of success using an Agile approach to implementing automation. We found it provides better collaboration between the automation engineers and the stakeholders in the solution. It also allows us to be much more agile with the scope. You're always going to have to veer a little bit one way or the other with the scope, depending on what you find. Some things may turn out to be too much effort to automate. Other things, from a testing perspective, become less important. And we found out that we end up much closer to the ideal solution in the end if we take an agile approach to implementing automation. So I have a couple, before we wind up, I have a couple miscellaneous topics that I want to cover. One is the conceptual approach to an automation framework that we found works, especially well in organizations that are looking to implement across multiple projects and applications. and the other is related to implementing an automated regression, system-level regression test within a group that takes an agile approach to developing their software. So first, from an approach perspective, one thing that I often see with frameworks is that they require an automation engineer to handle all the activities, meaning that the tests themselves are defined in a way that only the automation engineer has access to or understands. This is probably fine if you have a single application and the effort associated with automation doesn't ever exceed a single resource. But however, if you're implementing automation across multiple applications, this can become extremely inefficient. In these situations, we like to implement an approach that separates out the automation engineer activities from the test analyst activities. And it allows each set of resources to focus on what they can add the most value to. It also allows a group of automation engineers to support multiple projects in more of a shared service model. It's much more efficient than staffing a dedicated automation engineer or engineers to a single project. Second is implementing system-level regression test automation for an agile development cycle. So to be clear again, I'm not talking about automation of unit tests or test-driven development. I'm talking about traditional automated regression tests of the system as a whole, which is still important independent of how you're developing that system. I see a lot of organizations trying to fit the automation cycle within a 2-week sprint. And while achieving that objective certainly would be nice, it's often not practical, depending on the impact and the changes that have to be built into that automated test suite. Rather, I like to think of each sprint as generating requirements, either for enhancement or maintenance, that a separate automation cycle will address. And depending on the level of effort required to address a given sprint's automation requirements, you may be able to implement them by the end of the sprint, but if not, that's likely okay as long as you're doing a good job of prioritizing that work and the highest value things are being addressed as quickly as possible. Okay, moving on to key summary points. If you take anything away from this webinar, I think these are the most important. First of all, test automation is not a tool, and that really implies, hey, you need to have realistic expectations about what it means to implement automation successfully and sustain it over the long term. To get there, you need to understand your readiness to succeed from an organization, process environment, and a technical perspective. And once you understand those things, then you can develop a roadmap to address any of the gaps in those areas, and then of course, implement the automation solution we feel in small phases over time. So it's about 11:50, coming up 11:50. I have time for a few questions. I'm going to address them now. Please feel free to submit questions while I'm talking. Any additional ones, if we don't get to them, I will personally get to them via email after the webinar. Okay, give me a second here to take a look. So looks like they fished out 3. If we have time for more, I'll take more. The first one, paraphrase here. You didn't mention any specific tools during the presentation. We are looking to use Selenium. I'm wondering if the contents of this discussion favors any specific tools. So I think what's being asked there, if I read between the lines a bit, is, am I promoting or thinking of, or consciously or subconsciously, of any particular type of tool or approach? And the question is no. These are things, process, environment, technical, organizationally, that are fundamental and to successful test automation. And again, I do firmly believe that those foundational factors are much more important than the tool you're using and the approach you're using. Yes, your tool has to support your applications, and yes, your approach, your framework needs to be maintainable and provide reliability and be scalable. But even if you do a great job with the tool and the framework, these foundational factors can sink you. So no, I don't have a specific approach or framework or tool in mind. And I certainly don't think that that these topics are any less important depending on your tool or your approach. Good question, though. This one is about test data and environment. So we have dedicated test data for regression testing and can control it. However, some of our data expires periodically, and we are continually having to update that data in our automated test cases. Very common factor. So if you have data that expires, and let me just, or typically something like an insurance policy that is active for a period of time, what we typically do is remove specific data from the automated test cases and replace it with what we call internally metadata. I think that's a good term. And then keep an external mapping, and the spreadsheet is fine, of that metadata, mapping that metadata to the actual policy that's currently active. So, and if you're testing some type of policy management system, for example, you may have 20, 50 policies, metadata that map to individual policies that are active at the time that you might use during your regression test. And then your framework, when it executes, can reference that external mapping at runtime and replace the metadata with whatever the current policy number is. And yes, you're still maintaining it, but you're not going to individual test cases in different places to do it. It's just one place and say, okay, I need to replace all my auto policies that expire, in October with whatever the new active is in my test environment. So there are some tools out there. I don't have specific or personal experience with them that will actually encapsulate your systems from a time perspective and allow you to roll time backwards and forward. Again, I don't have any personal experience with them. I've heard some good things. I've heard some things that says, well, it really depends on your system and what your environment looks like, but that might be something to investigate as well. And we'll take one more, going a little bit over our 45 minutes here, so we'll take one more question and then we'll answer the rest via email. And this looks, it's related to the last topic we talked about, and that's Agile teams. We currently have Agile teams that are responsible for maintaining their portion of the automated regression test, but very few of them work over time. What approach can we use to get better results? So what I'm saying there is that the individual dev teams or the development pods are responsible for maintaining their portion, their area of the regression test that is associated with their features. We have found that doesn't work very well either. This may fly in the face of kind of an Agile approach, but having a dedicated automated regression test team that takes the requirements, again, kind of how we talked about in that last slide, takes the requirements of what needs to be enhanced or maintained in the automated regression test is a much better approach. I think the reason is the developers understand their environment, they understand their features in a fairly narrow context. And if you have a larger system-level regression test that has its own framework and own rules about how you automate tests, when they try to kind of go from their narrow context to a broader system-level context, things get lost in translation. And whereas a dedicated team can maintain that broader context, and as they take new features as requirements for enhancing that automated regression test, they do a much better job of implementing them in a way that they're going to be able to live on in that environment for a much longer time. So hopefully I answered those questions, the live ones, to your satisfaction. If not, again, you can hit me up really quickly in the chat window, or I've got some information with my contact information up on the screen. What we'll do is everyone that attended will send out this presentation, so you have it. We'll also put up a link. We'll include a link to the recording, so you can refer back to it, and also just use this contact information if you have any further questions. So to everyone that joined, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. Look forward to maybe talking to you in the future, but everyone have a great day and a great rest of your week. Thank you.